But damn, is it tasty, right?
Yeah, it is.
Hence the need for the CSPI guy, right?
That's
Yeah.
right. He's got to come in and protect us from ourselves.
Yeah, so how much regulation do you think we need before we really get it? Do you think his job will be the CSPI guy? His job will be done, or
Never.
do we just
Well,
constantly need more and more regulation until we finally get knocked over the head and figure it out?
his job will never be done. He'll never let it be done. He's kind of like Al Sharpton. Do you think the day will ever come when Al Sharpton will go, okay, you know what? There's really not a big racial problem for me to deal with anymore. I hereby retire.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't think so. The guy from CSBI, I mean, he's gone, and we're talking about Michael Jacobson for people who don't know.
What does
Uh,
that stand for again? Center for.
the Center for Science in the Public Interest.
Oh, that's right.
Very
And the
official.
only problem with that is they don't deal with science, and what they do is not in the public interest. They are a radical vegetarian group. That's not how they promote themselves to the media. You almost never hear that mentioned in the media. Now, I don't think people in the media are that stupid. I think they know what they're about. On the other hand, they are a source of reliable hyperbole, which makes for good copy and makes for good sound bites. So I think the media does not expose who they really are because they kind of like getting those juicy quotes from them.
And for some reason, the mainstream media seem to adore the twin powers of taxation and regulation that the CSPI guy uses, right?
Yes, they do. I don't want to get into a whole dissertation about bias in the media, but I did go to journalism school. And I can tell you that you've heard that about 90% of the press leans left.
Mm-hmm.
That was exactly my experience in journalism school. So I was going to school 25 years ago with the future journalists of the world. And my impression at the time was most of these people, if there were no journalism major available, they would have been majoring in something like social work.
Mm-hmm.
So there is very much a do gooder mentality that attracts people to journalism. Unfortunately, most of them think doing good requires taxation and regulation.
Yeah, kind of using
Yeah.
coercion to get people to be more moral or do the right thing and to be virtuous. And yeah, that's a real common thing. They
Yes.
have good intentions, but it leads to basically more errors and people being less healthy, as we can see all around us. So, one of the main issues in the movie was dealing with the lipid hypothesis and trying to ferret out exactly how this got started and why it's a huge scam just perpetrated on people that don't really understand the nature of how this all got started. Like, why is fat and cholesterol the main issue?
hmm Well, the way it got started, at least in this country, and the way it became popularized, and for those who don't know, the lipid hypothesis briefly says it's a two-part hypothesis. Number one, eating saturated fat raises your cholesterol, and number two, high cholesterol is what causes your arteries to get clogged up and leads to heart disease and other cardiovascular diseases. Now, the way that got popularized in the United States, there was a scientist, and I'm going to have to use that word in quotes here because he didn't act like a scientist, named Ansel Keys, who proposed that eating fat raised your cholesterol and led to heart disease. And in order to give some credence to his theory, he presented his 7 countries study in which he showed 7 countries on a chart with their fat intake and their rate of heart disease. And wouldn't you know it, it created this nice, smooth line going from, on a chart from your lower left to your upper right. In other words, indicating a really strong causality. And by gosh, the more fat, the more heart disease. Now, there were a lot of problems with his study. Number one, he actually had data available from 22 countries. He picked the 7 specifically that allowed him to produce that nice clean chart. Other people have gone back and selected 7 different countries from the 22 countries for which he had data available, and they were able to make the line go exactly the opposite way. The more fat, the less heart disease.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he was so convinced that his theory was correct that he basically called everything else an anomaly, and he put out his 7 countries study and said, here it is. Now, the other problem with that is if you went back and you looked at his 22 countries and you were to track sugar intake versus heart disease, you don't have to cherry pick 7 countries to get a smooth line. If you look at sugar intake, you actually see a true relationship. But he was convinced it was fat, so that was the theory he promoted. Now, originally, the scientific world poo-pooed him and said, no, this isn't right. He cherry-picked his data.
Confirmation bias to the max, right?
Yeah.
Right. There are other factors involved. So he really didn't get a lot of traction immediately. Unfortunately, number one, from what I've read, he was a very, very hard driving, arrogant sort of person who, was not going to be denied. And the worst part of it was he ended up on the board of the American Heart Association,
Uh-huh.
which had criticized his study some years before, but once he ended up on the board, suddenly they adopted it. And from there, it kind of snowballed.
Yeah, despite Robert Atkins' best attempts to talk some sense into the Heart Association, it didn't really work, did it?
No, unfortunately it didn't. And of course, eventually the whole theory got the stamp of approval by our own government, which is, there's two problems with that. One is that people think, well, the government wouldn't have an interest one way or another, so what they tell us must be true. We should know better, but that's what a lot of people think. The other problem is research tends to go in the direction of the funding, and the government is the 900-pound gorilla of funding.
Yes.
Yep. So follow the money again, right?
Yes.
Follow the money.
Right.
Yeah. If it stops moving in the marketplace, you subsidize it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So Tom, why do you think that we can't, as Americans, we can't shake out of this low-fat craze that started, 20-something years ago? I mean, I grew up with the whole low-fat thing, and I thought it was great. I thought, yeah, eat fat, get fat, so just cut out as much fat as possible, and I'd be really healthy. But now to find out that that's just couldn't be further from the truth.
And that's what dietitians are saying, basically. All the ones that I went to for my type 1 diabetes, they would put me on the high-carb, low-fat diet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing. As far as how we're going to get out of it, I don't remember who I'm quoting here, but there's a saying that scientific progress is often the result of funerals.
Yeah.
The old guard almost has to die out. And it's not just in this area. This has happened in science over and over. A theory gets established, and then people's careers begin to depend on that theory. The funding goes in the direction of that theory. The peer-reviewed journals end up being controlled by people who accept that theory. And, when I was growing up, I thought science was this wide open, objective process where everybody's out there doing experiments and the best information rises to the top. Unfortunately, that's not true. There's a lot of control, as Gary Taubes pointed out in his fabulous book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. There are literally a handful of people who have controlled the conversation about nutrition for the past 20 or 30 years.
Amazing.
And I mean literally controlled. They control the purse strings for the funding. They control the peer-reviewed journals. They occupy some of the seats in government where these policies are established. There's a very incestuous relationship between the food industry and government and the pharmaceutical industry in this field. We're literally talking about a handful of people controlling the conversation. I'm afraid we probably won't truly get away from this until those people are gone.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
It's all for the common good, though, isn't it? I mean, the FDA and the USDA, all these sort of top-down organizations that are, regulating society and making sure that people are eating the right things, aren't they providing folks some good positive benefits? I can't really say that with a straight face.
Are we going by the mission statement or the reality?
Yeah, it's two different things, isn't it? I mean, there's something to be said for good intentions, but like you say, when they are just isolated from objective analysis and they don't want to take into account all the evidence and they have their own agendas and their funding is gained through, rather than voluntary interaction in the marketplace, like people in the free market do, it's gained through taxation.
Right.
And it's obviously going to skew the way people are thinking and the way they're funding things.